So I'd like to welcome tonight's speaker, Pete Jackson, Chair of Nenthead Mines Conservation Society and a mining enthusiast since probably you're in short trousers, Pete. So now then, I'm not sure what the next process is. Alex, do you, or Pete, can you share your screen and Alex unmute Pete? Is that the process?
He's not muted, he just needs to speak.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I'm about to share screen.
Well, I'll mute myself and hand over to Pete.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Alistair. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak to the Historical Society. The intention of my talk tonight is to give you a general introduction to mining in the North Pennines. I won't cover every detail. I hope we'll have a bit of light-hearted humour at the end, taking up Alistair's point. And it's mainly a picture show with some words as well. As always, in the chat at the end, I would welcome any questions or comments or corrections indeed, or if you know something that adds on to what I'm talking about, I'll be very glad to hear about it. So thank you for listening in advance, and I hope you enjoy the talk. I do tend to talk a bit too much. I'm very well aware of that. So I'm on self-control tonight, hoping I cut down some of my nattering. If in doubt, I'm sure either Alistair or Alex will stop me at the right moment. Okay. So the title picture, Mining in the North Pennines. Just a reminder that most of us in the North Pennines live very high up compared to the rest of England and the UK. It's a very inhospitable landscape, and that's something that's worth remembering when we're talking about mining and how it proceeds in the Pennines. This is a picture actually of Weirhead last winter. Good question is, I think, why so much mining in this particular area? Well, geologists define it in a certain way, which we'll come to in a minute. So it's a very well-defined geological region. Underneath us are some granite rocks. They have been proved in some places to actually exist after they were theoretically described, and probably it's approximately about 1,000 feet below the current ground surface is when we reach the granite rock. Why are we so interested in the granite? That's because granite forms a convection channel. So as you go further into the Earth's crust, it does get warmer, and the heat tends to rise through certain rocks much easier than others. And granite is one of those channels that allows, if you like, the heat to rise up much more readily. How minerals are formed in the Earth's crust and why they arrive in certain places, like the North Pennines, is very much still a matter of debate by geologists. But one thing that is reasonably well understood is that where the minerals end up is very much linked to warmth, and so obviously any countryside or any rock that's sitting on top of granite is likely to be a place where minerals arrive in millions of years ago from perhaps somewhere else. The current thinking is that a lot of the minerals that we're going to talk about and that we find in the North Pennines came from somewhere to the east, perhaps under what is the current North Sea. But again, that is a matter of big debate. Coal deposits that are part of the natural rocks that are laid down in the North Pennines are affected by the heat. And so the warmer you heat up coal seams that have been laid down in millions of years ago, the better grade of coal you end up with. And that's very important for the reason why we have coal mining still going on, particularly near Alston. Just a brief comment about mineral formation. If we were to go back millions of years, this part of the country, the North Pennines, would probably be almost certainly somewhere else on the Earth's crust. The land masses that we know tend to move around on the Earth's crust, and so it's more likely that we're somewhere near the tropical area, so much warmer land. The Earth was a lot warmer. Something called global warming was going on at the time, and perhaps the current land surface that we see now, when we go to say Killop Law or somewhere like that, would be perhaps 1 or 2 kilometers below the Earth's surface at the time. So as well as sitting on top of this granite, it's also warm because it is 2 kilometers down, and it's also under a great deal of pressure because of that weight of rock sitting on top. So you've got ideal conditions for warm fluids moving through the Earth's crust under some sort of pressure. They encounter cracks and joints in the Earth's crust, which allow them to move upwards. And as they move upwards, they start to cool down as they get away from the heat source, and also the pressure reduces because they're getting higher up, less weight on top. And at that point, it's generally believed that the minerals that are in these hot liquids start, if you like, to crystallize as the liquids condense a little, and eventually we get a lot of the metalliferous minerals, particularly forming in these cracks in the Earth's crust. The coal seam that I touched on earlier is actually a rock, so that forms in a different way. You're probably well aware that we have at various times in Earth's history very hot jungle with very large tree growth, and as they decay, that turns eventually into a layer of rock in the Earth, and eventually that becomes for the formation of coal. So that's why there's so much mining in this particular area. We're not unique, of course. This occurs in other parts of the world as well. This is a very simplified geological map to give you an idea of where the granite might be. So to geologists, the whole area of the North Pennines is called the Alston Block, as it happens. We're defined on the west side. You can see the descriptor of the Pennine faults. Oops, sorry, back one. And around this area here, and that's the Eden Valley going down the escarpment down to Melmaby, for example. You've crossed over the Pennine fault. On the north side here, oops, sorry, keep hitting something wrong. On the north side, we have the Stublick fault, which is roughly following the Tyne Valley. There's a farm called Stublick just as you drop down on the way to Hexham. On the south side, we've got the Loondale fault, following the Loondale Valley, coming off Teesdale. East side, not so well defined, but doesn't seem to matter. This, apologies. This shaded area here, which is a sort of grayer touch to it, is where geologists think the granite is closest to the Earth's surface at the present time. You can see we've got a label there saying the Rookup borehole. That was a borehole that was drilled vertically down from the village of Rookup in the 1960s and actually encountered the granite in depth, about 1,000 feet down. The other areas that are in grey on the map are where, by using methods of exploration from the Earth's surface, by measuring the amount of gravity force, we can estimate roughly where the granite might be. Since the Rookup borehole was sunk, we've also sunk another borehole in the Weardale Valley, approximately where the Eastgate cement works used to be until they were demolished. Another borehole was put down in more recent years, which also proved the granite in depth. So if you think about this grey area and the outline of the buried granite, which is the line with hatching just on one side, that gives you an approximate idea of where the old miners found the best minerals when they were hunting for different minerals such as lead and zinc and fluorine in the Earth's crust. This diagram is trying to give an idea of what goes on within the Earth's crust. So we're looking at a section through the Earth's crust, like as if we'd taken a slice through a layered cake. So at the top, we've got sort of dry stone wall appearance rocks with some orange bands and then some black bands. So the black bands are meant to be perhaps coal seams or very soft rocks like shales. Above them, usually the orangey coloured rocks are perhaps sandstones, which are largely formed of ground up quartz with perhaps a thin layer of other minerals mixed in with them. So they tend to fall sandstones of the type that a lot of Alston, for example, is built from and is currently quarried at the Flinty Fell quarry up above Nenthead. Above those on this diagram, we've got like the dry stone wall, grey blocky picture, and that's meant to represent the limestone rock, which again is a little harder than the sandstone below, and is formed from trillions and trillions of tiny sea creatures that lived in a hot tropical sea, fell to the sea bottom, and eventually over time became hardened into a very limey rock. So we've got this pattern of a limestone rock, a sandstone, a coal seam, and some shales, and then as you can see, it repeats. So it's a cyclic process as the Earth's crust sinks slowly under the weight of the sea and ocean, and there is incoming material being weathered off nearby mountains. We get perhaps the shales and the sandstones deposited in the sea or on the shore of the sea. And then perhaps there's a stable period when it's hot tropical sea and the limestone rocks form in that tropical sea. At some point later on, there's movement in the Earth's crust, and the vertical cracks you can see that are sort of wandering up and down, they're formed, and they're known as geological faults, and they're just basically cracks in the crust. If we look at the bottom of the picture, we've got the pink mass in the middle, which is meant to represent the granite, and then each side some grey and light grey, dark grey wavy lines. They're much older rocks that the granite has pushed itself into. It's like intruded into the older rocks. And the top of the granite, the top of the older rocks, at some point has been eroded away by ocean, a big sea, just weathering it down into a flat surface. So when those hot liquids I was mentioning earlier arrive from perhaps the east or the west, coming through the old rocks or the granite, and then reaching these points where the heat from the granite is causing them to rise, those hot waters then follow the cracks or the fault lines up towards the surface. And it is thought in some quarters as well that as the liquids cool down, they start to descend again. But again, it's very theoretical, but backed up by a great deal of science. It's just that there are many interpretations available as to how this mineral formation took place. This is a picture in a mine in Alstonmoor, and we're looking at about, field of view is about 3 feet wide, about 1 meter wide, and about 0.7 of a meter high, a couple of feet high. And the top half of the picture, the sort of slightly shattered rock here with fractured edges, is a hard limestone. And you can see the base of the limestone here. And then below it, we have this greyish, part yellowish area as well. And that is what would have been a coal seam in better times. So you can see it's starting to form into very dark patches here and there. In a classic situation would be a nice coal seam. It isn't here. And then where it ends below, we've got this yellowish greyish material, which is much softer than the limestone at the top. And that's the sort of soil originally millions of years ago that's sort of hardened up now. And then you've got a forest growing on the top, which eventually decays and forms the coal seam. There's all sorts of interesting chemistry going on here. And this thing in the middle here is actually a lump of ironstone. So because of the chemical conditions that were occurring in the sea at the time, we then start to get iron minerals being brought together, if you like, precipitating round a hard core. So in the middle of this lump of iron, you can see here, we've got like perhaps just a granite pebble or a quartz pebble that's washed into the sea, and the ironstone starts to form around it. In a classic situation, those ironstones would be there'll be so many of them that they would join together and you would get a whole layer of ironstone, which that becomes economically important. But you can see here, there's just one, which is more typical of what we might see in lots of the North Pennines. So that's the sort of those cake slices, if you like, that we saw in the previous diagram. That's what it actually looks like when you see it underground. So what did we find over many hundreds of years in the North Pennines? This is a list of the majority of minerals and other economic products that we've mined over several hundred years. So the left-hand column tells you the name of the mineral and its chemical symbols. The right-hand side is tons, not metric tons, old-fashioned imperial tons. So this is what's been recorded. So if, for example, we take the mineral galena, which is lead sulfide, PBS, and from that we do eventually produce lead. And you can see we've produced about 5.7 million tons of galena over several hundred years from the North Pennines. Probably a bit more than that, but that's a sort of pretty verifiable figure. So as we work down, you can see we've got zinc minerals, much smaller quantity, fluorite, producing the fluorine mineral at the end, quite a big amount there. Copper minerals, chalcopyrite, not as much, quite a small quantity. The barium minerals, the barytes, again, quite a considerable amount. Then limonite, which produces iron for us. And then from galena, I put the Ag is silver, and you can see approximately about 40 tons of silver is being produced that we know about. Again, that may be a larger figure. And last by no means least, of course, is coal. And I haven't been able to track down over the years the sort of production figure for the North Pennines, but I'm still working on that. But it's not, obviously not as much as, say, the Durham and Newcastle coalfields or the Workington and Whitehaven coalfields. It's a small beer up in the North Pennines, but it's still significant. So we just talk about the varying amounts, you know, 5.7 million tons of lead produced. Obviously, in relative terms, historically, lead was a high value mineral to mine, worth mining, worth investing money in. Zinc minerals were not until really the end of the 19th century. And then the amount that's been found in the North Pennines is clearly a lot less anyway. Fluorine was neglected. It had no economic value till about the beginning of the 20th century. You can see we've produced quite a lot from the North Pennines, but again, a lower value. Copper's insignificant. Barium is an even lower value mineral than fluorine, but we've produced quite a lot. Iron, 1.7 million tons. Mainly one big burst of activity in the middle of the 19th century. A guy called Charles Atwood established an ironworks at Tow Law on the basis of the fact that, you know, there's iron visible in the mines around the North Pennines, and he put a blast furnace up at Stanhope, for example, as well. And you know, all of a sudden we were going to be producing millions of tons of iron. Unfortunately, Charles Atwood found that the amount of iron was limited, and so he then moved east and went to Consett, and eventually the iron ore was imported from other countries. However, you'll see later on, small quantities of iron have been produced continually over many hundreds of years from the North Pennines, but not really significantly. The silver is economically very important because until about 1900, silver had a very high value on the world market, and then it declined in value. It's been found by extracting it from the mineral at the top, the galena, the PBS, and it occurs in minute quantities. In imperial measures, we might be talking about 4 ounces of silver in a ton of lead. So it's not a lot, and you have to go through quite a complicated process using a lot of fuel to get it out. So it's only worth doing if the price of silver is high. So that's what the North Pennines have produced. One product which isn't on that list is stone. There are 1 or 2 mines in the North Pennines which actually have produced stone. Why is that? You know, we're flipping out, there's rock sticking out the ground everywhere, isn't there? And there's active quarries still working, limestone, sandstone, and so on. But at various times, mining for stone has taken place because perhaps a particular layer of rock was worth following underground. And from what we can work out, that particularly applies if we're talking about the search for roofing slates made out of stone. If you've ever had to buy any roofing slates to repair your house, you'll appreciate how expensive they are. And I think that's probably why at various times we've gone and mined stone underground. Quick word about early history. A lot of people say, oh, the Romans came and, you know, mined in the North Pennines. Well, in my opinion, the jury's still out. There isn't any hard evidence as yet that they actually did mine. There's lots of circumstantial information around, but we haven't yet found the evidence for the actual mining. But what we can say, that documents exist, which is the basis of my early history list here. So right from iron mining at Rookup, silver mines of Carlisle, we're not quite sure where they are, but there's a strong supposition that probably they were around Alston, but we're not entirely sure yet. And you can see a list of other things, other years when there's various documentary evidences available. The king at the time was always interested in mining, particularly of Alston Moor, particularly of Weardale, because mines were known from quite early times. And you can see by 1350, we've even got a guy coming from Germany and leasing the mines at Blakehill, and so on. So we've got Weardale leases. In 1560, Elizabeth I was so concerned about us poor Brits being pretty ignorant about mining that she brought a lot of miners from what is now southern Germany to mine copper, particularly at Keswick and round about there. And the archives still exist for that mining at round Keswick. And from that, we know that they were actually purchasing lead ore that was being transported from Alston to Keswick to be refined. Later history, so we're getting, you know, into the Industrial Revolution and the current day. So the 1730s on, mining starts to develop a lot more, particularly for lead. There's more capital available, and people are thinking of new ways of working, as we all know. The Northeast Coalfield particularly generated a group of people who were, if you like, rich and had spare money. And some of that money came to be invested in the North Pennines in lead mining, in the hope they would make as much money through lead mining as they did in coal mining. Didn't turn out to be the case. Coal mining's reasonably predictable, in that if you dig a hole and you find the coal seam, it will probably run for quite a long way, maybe several miles. Lead mining is not like that. It's very random. 1850s, I've already mentioned about the boom in iron mining, particularly in Weardale, but also around Alston. I think Alistair will mention it at the end, but he did a very useful paper with another author about where iron mining took place. By the 1890s, lead mining in the UK generally is in terminal decline, but not finally gone completely. That's because cheaper lead is being produced elsewhere in the world, Spain and the USA particularly, and we just can't compete. One thing that saves us, if you like, in the North Pennines from total depopulation and depression is the emergence of fluorspar mining, particularly in Weardale. That has always been found in the mines, the fluorspar, but was just thrown away as having zero value. And then a market was starting to develop, and so a lot of the mines were reworked for fluorspar, or whether it was the dumps outside that were just waste dumps, or actually going into the old lead mines and reworking them. So that sort of saved a lot of jobs at the time. Meanwhile, zinc is becoming more valuable. And particularly in 1914-18, in the First World War, we need a lot of zinc because we use that to make brass. And clearly, as you're probably well aware, that's used to make shell cases. And we have the Shell scandal and the Lloyd George government trying very hard to produce much more brass without having to import it. So there's a sort of big boom in zinc mining, which ends at the end of the First World War, partly because the government had signed a 10-year contract with a mine in Australia, agreeing to produce all their zinc mineral. And so, again, the English mines had no chance of competing. There's always been coal mining going on in the North Pennines, but often it's probably just on a very small scale for a particular valley or a particular village or town. But in the 1930s, we see the growth of more commercial coal mining, particularly around Alston, Ale and so on. And that, as you know, is carrying on to the present day. Fluorspar mining really ends in 1999, and Grove Rake mine in the Rookup Valley is the last big fluorspar mine, and that closes then. Again, commercial. We can't compete against the price of fluorspar being imported from China. So, is there any mining going on now? Yes, there is. We have the semi-anthracite coal being mined at Ale Colliery at Alston. But clearly that's a declining market, and if we believe what the government say, you know, at some point we'll probably be totally banned from burning this stuff. So obviously a very difficult future for coal mining. Fluorspar is being mined at a mine near Frosterley, and the reason for that is it's purely for collectors. You know, it's labelled for gemstones, but actually people just buy fluorspar, nice pieces if you like, to put in display cases. And there is a big market for that in the USA in particular, and Germany and France as well. So let's step back a bit. We've gone through all that sort of background material there, and these are the minerals, and this is how much is being produced. But if we think back, you know, whether it was the Romans or whether it was somebody before them, or whether it was just us Brits in about 1000, how did we know this stuff was in the ground? And I think the reason why we know is because, one, people had already developed the expertise anyway, perhaps in other parts of the world and other parts of the UK. And as they walk across the moors, like the gentleman is in this picture, we see the rocks sticking out. And this is high on a hill on the north side of Teesdale. And where the guys stood, you can see a sort of rough channel in the grass, about here, and this area here, and rocks sticking out just here. And this is the top of the mineral vein, which is now grassed over. So I think we can guess quite safely that people would prospect in the area looking for minerals outcropping in the ground. And if they found some rich material, then it's very easy, isn't it? Picking a shovel and a crowbar, for example, and get in there and dig it out, and away we go. And there's probably a lot of places like that in the hills, that wherever at the time. And so we don't need to go underground, dig holes any deeper, and so on. We might be lucky and we have something like this. So the bare rock you can see here, which has a sort of slight orange tinge to it, is actually a mineral vein sticking out of the ground. The reason why it's been left is because it's largely very low grade iron with some of the country rock mixed in with it. And this is part of a lead mine in Weardale. So again, from what we know from exploring other parts of the world in recorded history, you can go to parts of Spain, for example, parts of the USA, anywhere it's hot and dry and there isn't a vegetation cover, and you will see mineral veins sticking out the ground like this. So again, you know, if you're a prospector, you just go for a walk, if you like. You recall the cairn that was excavated near Alston in recent years, and the fact that a gold earring was found for the guy who had probably been buried there. And that was very similar to the earring found on a guy down at Amesbury who was reckoned to be a copper mine prospector. So if we go back, you know, pre-Roman times, people were out prospecting in the UK for minerals, and that obviously carried on. Okay, so we've found this place where there's an outcrop of rock with some mineral in it. How are we going to get out of the ground? Well, we start off, we'll do the easy stuff first. A mineral like lead, the lead galena mineral, is very soft, relatively speaking. If it's wide enough and you hit it, it just breaks. If you hit it with a hammer or a shovel or something like that. And eventually, of course, you get further down, so you start to need to dig a deeper trench. We'll call that like open cast mining, which is obviously a very current method in many parts of the world. But sometimes the rock might get a bit hard, or, you know, it's getting flipping hard work, picks and shovels and crowbars. So what the old guys did was build dams high on the hilltops and then fed the water to certain places where they thought the mineral was, or they knew it to be, dug quite a narrow channel down the hillside in the right place, and then unplugged the dam suddenly and let the water rush down this channel and wash away the rocks. And reading the accounts of this method, which was used until at least the middle of 19th century, very effective. They talk about moving very large pieces of rock, you know, as big as like garden sheds, for example, that way. So, you know, labor saving, plenty of water. It does rain most of the year, doesn't it? And so on. And what we're looking at here, this is in Teesdale. This is a big channel here where that method of mining has been used. And it's a process known as hushing, like as be quiet. It's an old term for mining like this. And you can see here, we've got a much narrower channel coming across the hillside around here and feeding into here. And that's also feeding water into the hush. And then you can't quite see, but coming down the hill here and carrying on down here is another feeder channel as well. And if you walk the high fells of Teesdale, Weardale and Tynedale and the Derwent Valley on the right time of year, March, April is a good time when the light's a bit low and you've got shadow, you will see there are hundreds of miles of leats running all the way around all our fell tops, collecting water for mining, for hushing or for treating the mineral afterwards. So hushing was very unpopular with the landowners because you can see at the bottom of the hush here, we've got a big bank of gravel that's been eroded by the modern river. And of course, it works its way down the river and silts up everywhere. And of course, the salmon can't survive in it and the trout and so on. And the gravel and the muck that's washed down the river, of course, tends to sort of cause flood and damage and so on. So it's generally thought that it had stopped by about the 1850s. To give you an idea of how big some of these hushes are, in the middle of the picture here that's the headgear of the Groverake mine in the Rookup Valley, which I'm sure most of you would probably have seen. And here's the road running up the valley, and there's a truck parked on it. Yeah. So up here, we've got a very big open cast and hush area coming down the hillside all the way down to the mine here. And then on both sides here are enormous waste tips from both hushing and from open cast mining, both for lead and for iron ore. So, you know, it's big business is hushing and open cast. Obviously a very satisfactory method of mining, because you've just got to build a dam, which you build out of turf and soil. You've got to wait for the rain, and then you pull the plug. Pace of life is slower, and it's kind of free, isn't it, the rainwater? When you've got underground and got going, when you can't go deep enough in a hush, you've got to dig a hole in the ground and you go down it. How are we going to get the rock out then? We can't use a hush, we'll just flood the mine. So what we're going to do is drill holes, and by then we've got something like gunpowder coming along just before 1700, and so we can drill a hole in the rock. So the guy on the left is holding a big chisel, a long bar with a sharp end, and the guy on the right is wielding a big hammer, and we're going to drill some holes in the rock, put some gunpowder in, off it goes, bang, and it splits the rock, so we can then break it up and get it out. No, sorry, what happened then? Oh, hang on a minute, I've lost myself. Oh, dear me, sorry about this. Pause for a minute. Don't know what's happened. Right, come on. Right, sorry about that. So yeah, so we can break the rock and we can get it out of the mine. How are we going to get it out of the mine? We're going to load it into a bucket. You can see here a bucket, a rope, and a guy loading up the bucket, and somebody at the top is going to wind it up. And here we have a picture of an old bucket which was found in the last 5 years in a mine in Weardale, very much like on the picture we saw there. Once we've got it out of the mine, we need to wash it, because the lead ore, which we're principally mining at the time, is mixed in with other rock waste we don't want. So what we do is break it up, and you can see here on this section here, we're going to break it up on a big flat stone area, into smaller pieces, and then we're going to put it into buddles, which are these items here, 1, 2, 3. Basically, running water, a slight slope. The lead ore being heavier will stick at the bottom of the buddle, and the lighter mud and other rock like sandstone will wash away. And you can see we've got sludge holes at the bottom, like here, and we dig that sludge out and perhaps we retreat that. We might put it in a tub like here with a sieve and shake it up and down. And again, the heavier lead will separate itself out. So think about it. This goes on for 200-300 years, this method, basically. And it's all hand working, isn't it? So it's sort of fairly small process, but, you know, labor's cheap and the lead is reasonably high value. Here in Weardale is the remains of one of these sites. So the left-hand side of the picture, you can see flat stones, wall at each end. That's the flat area where the guys would sit and crush the rock. And then the stone on the right-hand side here is just a small bunker where, having smashed it all up, they will put it there waiting for the guy to come along and put it in the buddle. As we get further into the 19th century, we start to think about mechanization. People starting to think about profit and improving the process. And this is Whiteside Mine near Garrigill, just above the road to Middleton. And we're looking up the valley to the east. And the mine entrance is by the building sort of middle right. And the guys, the one in the middle is stood right on top of a water wheel. And there, that water wheel drove a crushing machine, a very early kind of rock crusher. And then in the foreground, you can see we've got lots of these sieves with big arms to waggle the sieves up and down. Again, a boy or a man would be doing that. And then right in the foreground, the narrow channels are where all the slimes end up. And we start treating those again to separate out the mud. You can see front right, we've got a round tub with a sieve in it. And somebody invented a method where you rotated it at speed, again, by hand. So, you know, they were thinking about it, but they were still managing to compete, basically using manual labor. So that's fine. We've got our hush, we've got our hole in the ground, a shaft down into the ground, and we start to think about maybe we need to go a bit deeper because we've exhausted the top stuff. So we drive horizontal tunnels into the hillside, and just behind the surveyor, you can see water, and that's coming out of like a little railway tunnel, a couple of meters high, running into the hillside. And then top left, you can see the rock dump, and on the right, you can see the sort of loose crushed rock. This is high on the hills above Cashwell, above Garrigill. And you can see one thing to remember as well is, I mean, this is nearly at 2,000 feet above sea level. A lot of mining goes on in very inhospitable places. So not only are we high up because we're in the North Pennines, but we're even higher up because we're looking for the minerals. Who were the guys who did this? Well, this is a picture of some miners at Nenthead outside a mine called Smallclough Mine. Date not totally unknown, but let's say sometime after 1900, perhaps 1910. They don't look very happy, do they, most of them, but this is a typical mining team at the time. And you can see we don't wear safety helmets or anything like that. But, you know, we're going to produce the mineral for the company. We have memories of these people left underground. We're looking here at some narrow gauge railway track, the two lines crossing the picture. And this is an area where there's a lot of dried mud in this particular mine. And you can see in the mud there, we've got the imprints both of horses' hooves and of clog irons. So, you know, these guys have lived on in various parts of the mine. When we see things like this, we might also see things like this. Somebody had a bit of spare time, I think, in this particular mine. And you can see, I believe in the middle, you should be able to see it. We've got H Spot 1794. Presumably that's him who did this carving. And he's carved a dromedary. And to make sure, he's actually done dromedary, the word below it as well. And to the left off this picture is also a line of pack ponies. There are several initials and so on. And Alistair will no doubt mention something again, because Alistair did some research on who was H Spot, and I think he found him in the church records here. This is another example. You got a lot of this yellow mud down the mines at times, and Mr. Archer has left his graffiti here in 1855. It's interesting to think about graffiti, isn't it? And how current mine explorers get extremely annoyed if other people go in and leave modern graffiti, leave their initials and name down a mine. But this is regarded as historically important, but not the modern stuff. And here's another one. We think this particular location in this mine, somebody had to come and check something roughly once a year. So you can, when you close up, you can see that once a year somebody's left their name, Thompson, Thompson, and so on. And Mr. Peart left his name up in May 1937. Obviously, it's interesting. It's real people. It puts a name to these miners, doesn't it? But also, this particular one helps us because this particular mine closed in 1937. So we guess Mr. Peart was on the track lifting gang, lifting the railway lines that they were taking out of the mine when it closed. Okay, so what does one of these mine tunnels, these horizontal tunnels, look like? And this is a typical view of a mine. If we look at the floor, you can see a lot of mud because at one time the mine had about 2 foot of water in it. So you got a lot of mud deposited. You can see where the railway track has been removed in the middle, and there's a railway sleeper propped up at one side. And then here you can see the bands of the loose shaly rock, all sorts of different colors because of the minerals in the shaly rock. And very vaguely, particularly sort of right front, you'll see vertical lines as well. And the method was that once they'd drilled and blasted and crowbarred it all out, they would then go along with a pick and trim the edges. So in the classic mine scenes as well, you see sort of several hundred yards of this neatly picked surface as well. But typically, we might see something like this as well. Stone arching, so dry stone walling brought in, side walls, arch built up. And again, some of these run for literally miles in the North Pennines. One of the interesting things was, if we talk about Nenthead and Alston particularly, the stone came from Flinty Fell Quarry, which, as you know, is still operating and producing very similar stone. Bear in mind that some of these mine tunnels have been in existence since 1700, 1750, or even earlier perhaps. There's one at Cold Clough that was probably driven before 1700. What happens if they manage to survive is that water runs down the walls, starts to leach out other minerals from the rock, which are there in minute quantities, and you get this very scenic view of looking down an old mine tunnel. So you can see we've got reds, whites, oranges, all sorts of things. And of course, the water in the bottom is heavily contaminated as well. Some of it might be reasonably benign, like calcium minerals or iron minerals. But if we start to get lead, zinc, and cadmium in particular, then we're in trouble. This is another mine where you can see we've got a wooden ladder and some wooden props, and then everything's been gradually encased in a white crust layer. This is a mineral known as hydrozincite because the zinc minerals in the rocks are easily to leach out and then are deposited very much like a stalactite in a cave. And if you look at the colour of the water, that's partly because I've just walked through and disturbed it when I took the picture, but it's also the water is heavily loaded with iron minerals and zinc minerals. But it's not all like that. If we're in the hard rock, in like the limestone, and the miners have dug the lead mineral out in particular, we might have a scene like this. A lovely flat roof, limestone, no supports, no timber, no stonework, no steel girders or anything, very self-supporting. This was created in about 1820, this particular part of this mine. And you can see where the guys are stood with their lights. There's some railway track just visible. And that's the sort of haulage way out of the mine. And the roof is in limestone. You can see like the dimples in it. And imagine that's the sea floor and a layer of mud coming in and sitting on top of the limestone. And you've got pools and rock pools. And you're actually seeing the impression, if you like, of that rock pool. This particular part of the mine was very rich because what happened was that chemically, the limestone rock has been attacked by the hot fluids that were bringing the lead minerals and completely altered and changed it. So the reason why the miners dug all this out is because it was nearly all lead ore. And one of the old accounts books says that the guy who was writing at the time said it was one of the richest places he'd ever seen in Alston Moor. He said it was like walking into a room full of lead ore. Well, now, if we contrast that with a more modern mine, this was a mine that was worked in the 1970s and 80s, a bit of a shoestring, and the guys obviously were obliged to provide support for the roof, so they took a lot of timber in, lovely big timbers you can see there, and were holding the roof up. And this is a picture taken in the last 5 years, and you can see what's happening. So rather an entertaining place to be in and to walk underneath. Yeah, the irony that I always think is that we'll lose some of the modern mines for archaeologists in the future, but the mines perhaps going back about 200 or 300 years will still be there because of all that stone arching. Interesting to note, this is a picture taken sometime after about 1909 in a mine at Nenthead, and you can see the stone arching and the railway track, and the locomotive in the picture is fueled by paraffin and petrol. And what's interesting about this picture, one, it's taken underground, two, it's a locomotive, which was fairly early for the UK. Some of the old guys who were long gone from Nenthead said it was a terrible place to be at the time because the fumes from the locomotive, of course, were just vented into the mine working. But if we look, this is the current place, the same scene. So we look at this pipe in the roof and then go back to the previous picture, rotate, we're looking the opposite direction, and there's the same pipe in the roof, and here's the junction. So it gives you an idea of how long some of these places can easily survive. You just need the locomotive now. When we're mining in one of those limestone places, like with the two guys stood in that limestone hole with their light shining on the previous picture, you end up with a slot like this. And this is in a mine at a place called Brownlee Hill, which is between Alston and Nenthead. And you can see again this white greyish stuff forming on the right is the zinc mineralization being leached out of the limestone rock. Complete contrast to that kind of mining is this. This is in the Groverake mine in the Rookup Valley, closed in 1999. Every modern safety feature. Lots of steel forming these arches that you can see with steel mesh in between. And you can see what's happening. It's not a distorted picture. The steelwork is bending under the pressure of the rock above it and below it. And again, some of these places will be lost in years to come or become just too difficult to record and photograph. Transportation underground, obviously very important. So originally it's just buckets, and then we come along with wheelbarrows, and then somebody invents railways. And here are two local people demonstrating how a mine wagon would be used underground. So we've got a narrow gauge railway line with a wagon that you can see it tips up at one end, and they're trying to show how the old miners might have emptied or used such a wagon. This is a more typical scene that survived of mining and railways till about 1914 in our area. You can see a nice group of people here. You can have a good fun time guessing what the different jobs were. The guy with the bowler and the guy in the white suit with the peaked cap and so on. And I always think the guy at the back here with the beard and the flat cap, he looks much more confident. I bet he was the real under manager and so on. And this is Rampgill mine at Nenthead. This is more typical scene of a mine. This is Rotherham Fell mine at Blackburn Bank, just above Ledgate. The mine entrance still exists, but is now used as part of a hydro scheme. And here you can see the long string of wagons with the horse pulling them out, and the two guys sat in the front wagon and some repair work going on outside. Haulage is very important. We're talking about a lot of these mines for 200 or 300 years being run reasonably cheaply, not with much mechanization. but you need sometimes to wind up and down in shafts. And what this contrivance here is a big winding drum. Imagine it was stood up. So this central shaft here should be vertical, but the whole thing has fallen over on one side. So the big wheel was a drum for the rope to go around, which a horse then was attached to it and walked around in continuous circles to wind the rope up and down the shaft. It's known as a horse gin or a whimsy. And this one has survived underground because it's made out of iron or steel, probably iron. Most of them were made out of wood and obviously just rot away. We're not all concerned with working underground. We might be working on the surface. And this is a picture again from Nenthead of some guys digging into one of the mine heaps to process the mineral, to load it into a processing mill. Probably 1910, perhaps 1920, something like that, probably 1910. And again, you know, we're all wearing our clothing. We've got clogs, we've got waistcoats and flat hats, and we're using the standard mine wagon of the time as well. Oops. Mentioned there about power. It's not really economical to bring steam coal into the North Pennines in the 19th century. Even when the railways came, it still was a bit pricey by the time you'd haul it somewhere to a mine. So the miners relied very much on water power. And this is an aerial shot of a typical reservoir. The miners were adept at building holding reservoirs on hillsides, tapping all the surface streams. So it's a continuation of the Hush technology, but we're collecting the water and using it to drive water wheels, or we're dropping it down. This is looking down a vertical shaft with big pipes, and we're dropping it down a shaft. And at the bottom, we've got Pelton wheels installed to generate perhaps electricity or compressed air. And this particular shaft is called the brewery shaft, and it's just on the south side of Nenthead village. At the bottom of brewery shaft, this is what you can see, an underground engine room with the remains of a Pelton wheel that's been partly stripped, and that was to generate compressed air for the mines around Nenthead. As well as Pelton wheels, we had water wheels underground across the whole of the North Pennines, often used for to drive water pumps. So we're using the water to work a pump which is much lower than the water wheel. This is actually a replica water wheel that's in the Killop mine over the hill in Weardale, but it exactly replicates the method of use of the miners. And there are places like Allen Heads where there were whole tiers of water wheels, perhaps 5 different horizons of wheels underground, pumping the water in stages to get it out of the bottom of the mine. If we go into the 20th century, the fluorspar miners had the same problem. They needed to wind and they needed to pump. And this is some machinery which was used until the 1980s in a fluorspar mine in Weardale. And it's about 200 feet underground. And this is a recent picture, and you can see everything's still there. And this, because it's metal and so on, generally will survive. It will rust and decay. But it's just really not worth taking it out at the time the mine closed. So a different kind of history, if you like, a different kind of technology. Mechanization came in. I've mentioned earlier about the locomotive underground, and this is, this is the ones at Nenthead outside the mine there. And this is right in the middle of Nenthead, particularly for Alston Moor. You know, this was the biggest processing site in the whole of Alston Moor, where Wright's bus depot used to be, and where Wrights now keep their buses in the open air at present. And you'll probably recognize, those of you who've been there for years, that the front part almost is what became the bus depot, this section here, and this back bit was the main processing part of the mill. And there was another building here as well. And the Miners' Arms is bit here, yeah. And here's the hive, the chapel. So we were at the forefront of technology when this mill was built in about 1909. And guess what? It came from somewhere else in Europe and was built by using German and French expertise. Of course, obviously now all being demolished. Are we all right for time, Alex? Yes, must be.
We're fine, Peter. Yes, keep going.
Okay, right. Not far to go. Once we've got the lead mineral out the ground and treated it, separated it from the waste rock we don't want, we need to process it. Well, traditionally, mineral was processed nearby in furnaces throughout the whole of the UK, if you like. For many years, that was a standard method. And there's not many pictures of these lead blast furnace buildings, if you like. This is the one at Allendale Town. It's between Allendale and Catton. And it's a postcard of what the site was like, very similar to a lot of lead smelting sites in the North Pennines. And it's been the subject of a lot of conservation work in recent years. A lot of it was demolished in the last 30 years, but what's left has been conserved and is an ancient monument. And you can see the complexity of trying to interpret something like this, as well as conserving it for the future. What do you do with a site like this? We have the same problem with a lot of old mining buildings throughout the North Pennines. Yes, it's very interesting. This particular one is a scheduled ancient monument. We dig it out, it gets conserved. A lot of money is spent. And we then interpret it. You know, we put signs up, we have leaflets and modern technology ways of doing it. But it's a very complex sort of picture to understand. And it may not be that exciting. You know, does everybody want to look at an old factory and an old mill or an old mine? As we go up the hill from that particular building, we encounter these. I'm sure you'll have driven down the road from Coalclough to Allendale to Catton and seen the chimneys on the hilltop, which are up here. Here's one of the chimneys, the tallest one. The reason why they're there, perhaps 4 miles away from the smelt mill in Allendale, is because quite early on, the guys found they had a pollution problem. So the lead fumes were killing off cattle, were killing off vegetation, and killing off people as well, no doubt. And so the early miners found that if you built long horizontal chimneys on the ground, you could capture a lot of the dust that was circulating with the hot air from the furnaces. And as the hot air traveled up these long chimneys on the ground, before it got to the hilltop, it would in effect condense. So you'd collect lots of lead oxide and other items as dust. And then perhaps about once a year, you'd run water down it and clean the surfaces and reprocess that dust. And it had the effect of stopping a lot of the pollution on the ground at the top. And also, it's recorded that by reprocessing the dust, you could actually pay for the building of the flues as well. So they were a source of profit. This is one of the curiosities to do with flues. The bridge here we're looking at is across what was an old railway line, the branch line from Hexham up to Catton, long gone now. But when it was built, it cut through one of these lead mining flues. And so this bridge was built. Now it's just preserved as a historic feature. But the top of the bridge had one of these horizontal flues built on top of it to serve the mill that was just down the valley here. So again, quite a curiosity, probably almost unique in the UK, I think. If you were to travel higher up above Rookup Village, you would come to this location. So you can see a very long collapsed horizontal chimney here, much overgrown, last used in the early 1900s. And every now and then, this particular type of flue would have a side diversion, and the fumes would be diverted into a little building like this, which we understand was stuffed full of brushwood, probably heather and ling dried out a bit. And every now and then they would come in and burn all the brushwood and get the lead dust out of it. And as you walk up the hillside following this old chimney, there's 2 or 3 of these buildings like this. I hate to think how toxic the ground is, you know, now in that sort of area. Well, the reason why I'm delivering this talk tonight to you is because I'm interested in mining and lead mining, and part of the fun I get out of it, if you like, is going in old mines and exploring them, and obviously now surveying and recording the archaeology and photography and so on. And I thought I'd just end with 2 or 3 pictures which show you what it's currently like in old mines. So you can see the photographer's boots at the bottom of the picture in the shadow. And then just in front of me, we've got the other explorer laid on his back, going under a very low bit of arching. What's happened here is that we've got one of those nice stone archings, which unfortunately has collapsed. And the reason why it's collapsed is because the mine tunnel is following a geological fault, and there's still some movement going on that fault line, and so it's falling in. And pick and shovel job here to dig it out, and you can see it's just big enough to get through. Some people have great trouble in getting through here, either because their waist is too big, or because it's a bit off-putting, you know, to lay on your back and stick your nose right up to the top of the arching and go through. I remember taking somebody through once that said, "We're not coming back this way, are we?" And I said, "Yes, we are. There is only one way, you know." Yes, it was can be a bit unnerving. Similarly, we do live most of the year in a pretty wet place in the North Pennines. So here's one of these little tunnels, half full of water. So if you want to go and explore it and survey it, you're going to get wet and muddy at the same time. And there are hazards like this one here. So very thoughtfully, the old miners have put a prop in to hold that large rock in the roof. This tunnel was probably driven about 1840. So I guess the timber's been in since that time. And you can see, I would hate to think how soft it is, but maybe it isn't doing the job anymore. So clearly there are hazards to recording the archaeology of old mines. You have to look out for this kind of thing and watch where you're going. Well, I'm about to end, and this shows you again some of this very contaminated water. And it's a topical point to talk, I think, about contamination, because the River Nent is one of the worst contaminated in the rivers in England for the amount of zinc that's in the water. And obviously zinc does kill vertebrates and most other things, vegetation, plants and other animals. And so, as you know, we've currently got a scheme being built halfway between Alston and Nenthead to treat the water, and it is principally to remove the zinc which is in the water. Lead's not so much a problem. It doesn't get mobile in the same way, but we really have to do something about the zinc. And no doubt in future years, we'll see other schemes elsewhere in the North Pennines. You know, there's this whole story about what is it, zinc cream for putting on the cuts and bruises and things on your body. And I've got a colleague, a friend, who is always suffered very badly with his skin, and he swears blind that if he goes in the levels and the mines at Nenthead where there's all this zinky water, when he comes out, his legs are greatly improved. I'm not quite sure whether to believe him, but you never know. If you want to know more about mining in the North Pennines, here's a list of places which you probably know most of these well, but I think are places that are worth visiting. So the Allen Smelting Mill, which is where the Allen Brewery is as well, which is a good reason for going because you can buy their beer at the brewery. Allen Heads Heritage Centre has got some really good interpretation panels, and there's one of the original hydraulic mine engines there in a building, which you can go and see very close up. At Colbury in Teesdale, that's in the Hood's Hope Valley, there's a restored mine shop there and quite a good mining landscape to look at. At Dukesfield, which is near Slaley, there's an old lead smelting mill in the valley there, which has been conserved, archaeologically excavated, and has got a panel of interpretation. Groverick Mine, Headgear, I'm sure you might have driven past that and seen it. There's no interpretation there yet, but there will be some, hopefully in the next 12 months. And down the valley there's an old lead smelting mill at Rookup, where there is just one arch left now, but a new panel is about to go up there. Clearly, Killop Lead Mining Museum is a star place to go. When everything's working correctly, you can go in the mine and also go in the buildings. The buildings are currently not fully accessible at the present time because they've got to do some repairs, but there's good interpretation in the museum there, good displays and so on. And of course, Nenthead Mines, where I hang out, we only open once a month, but we do take you down the mine, and it's easy going, and you can see what it was really like for the lead and zinc miners, and we can serve you homemade tea and cakes as well. So thank you for listening. Hope it didn't go on too long, and that's the end.